Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So, welcome everyone to session 5 of our course. Today we are talking about Uppalavaṇṇā, the second chief disciple of the Buddha, the female counterpart of Mahamoggallana, and also the nun foremost in psychic powers. So I will share my screen and then we can start and have a look at what we're doing today. So today, firstly, we will have a look at her life story in the Dhammapada commentary. So that's quite a late text, but I just wanted to give a brief overview over her life before we jump in detail into her stories. And then we are going to read an early text. So actually Uppalavaṇṇā has two early texts in our sources. One is her poem in the Therīgāthā, which we are not going to look at today. And the other one is her sutta in the Bhikkhunīs Samyutta. And this sutta exists in 3 versions, one Pali version and 2 Chinese versions. And because I'm assuming that most people will be familiar with the Pali version, we're going to read from the Chinese. But actually those suttas are all, because they're parallels and they're all really, really similar, it doesn't really matter too much which we are reading. But I thought it would be nicer to read one that is not so widely known. And then we are going to look at later texts, the Vinaya texts about Uppalavaṇṇā. And in almost all Buddhist traditions, Uppalavaṇṇā is very much associated with stories about sexual assault, stories about rape, stories about sexual harassment. So this is something that we cannot avoid looking at when we talk about Uppalavaṇṇā. So today will be a little bit of like a heavy topic, talking about sexual assault. And connected with that, in most traditions are also the rules about staying in the wilderness for bhikkhunīs, or not staying in the wilderness for bhikkhunīs. So that's something that we should also look at when we talk about Uppalavaṇṇā. And of course, the rules for staying in the wilderness, they are not, these are not minor rules. I mean, it looks like they're minor rules in the Vinaya, but they have a huge impact on the ability of women to practice the Dhamma properly. Because if you cannot go into a quiet place, a secluded place, and at the time of the Buddha, or at the time, even the centuries after the Buddha, that would have meant going to the wilderness, because the cities, they're crowded, there are too many people, and there's noise. And of course, back then, kutis weren't insulated the way they're insulated now. People didn't have triple glazed windows. So if you're in the city or in a village, then you're really in the middle of the noise. So not being able to go to the wilderness really impacts on women's abilities to practice the higher stages of the path, to actually develop samadhi and to actually develop the path to arahantship, and to get the fruits of the holy life that they should be getting. So the rule about not staying in the wilderness are actually that's quite a huge restriction on the bhikkhunīs. So that's what we are going to look at today as well. But before we start with all the heavy topics, let's have a look at her life story. So I will be reading from the Dhammapada commentary, or actually from a text that was written by Venerable Veraguda Saradathero. He translated the Dhammapada in the book Treasury of Truth, and he added the commentarial stories. But I think this is not a proper translation of the commentary. It's just like a summary that he gave, but I think it's good enough, and it's a nice and short text. So I thought it was suitable for our course, just to get an overview over her life. So the story begins. Uppalavaṇṇā was born in a wealthy family and was named after the lotus flower, Uppalavaṇṇā. So Uppala is actually the name for the blue lotus, and Vanna just means beauty. And of course, some people might know in the later tradition, it was said that Uppalavaṇṇā actually had the color of the blue lotus flower, so that her skin color was blue. In the early text, there's no indication whatsoever to say that there was anything unusual about her skin color. So I think we can safely assume that that is a later legend. But the lotus flower obviously was very popular back then, so naming a girl or a woman after the lotus flower was probably an obvious choice back then. So anyway, when she came of age, proposals for marriage came from all quarters, and the harassed father did not wish to offend any suitor by a refusal. To the father, ordination in the noble sangha was the only solution. The daughter, true to her destiny, agreed. Upon being ordained, she was kept in charge of the convocation room, i.e. the Uposatha hall, where the nuns assembled for the confession of lapses. She had to tend to the lamps. She observed that the light was sustained by the wick and the oil. Sometimes the light goes out by going short of either or by a gust of wind. So life was due to comic force. This kept her thinking till she became an arahant. She remembered her former lives. It was while living alone in a forest, a young shepherd named Nanda, a kinsman of hers, got infatuated with her and committed a sexual offense as soon as she returned from a round of alms. Coming from the noonday glare to the dark cave where her abode was, she could not see, and hence she was taken by surprise despite her protests. He committed the dire deed and was immediately born in the hell when the earth yawned and swallowed the foolish young man. He was, however, dead before the yawning of the earth. It was after this incident the Blessed One prohibited the female disciples of the noble sangha from living in isolation in the forest. Not long afterwards, the Buddha, addressing the monks, declared Uppalavaṇṇā Mahateri was foremost for psychic power, as Venerable Mahamoggallana was among the Bhikkhu Arahats. So here we get a little introduction into her story and the association with the sexual assault stories, and also that she was the cause for laying down this rule about not living in the forest for bhikkhunīs. But obviously this is a much later text. So before we go into detail into those texts, I just want to show you her sutta from the Bhikkhunī Samyutta, which shows a completely different picture, of course, otherwise I wouldn't be showing it. So, as I mentioned, this is from the Chinese version of the text. And the sutta begins. Thus have I heard. One time, the Buddha was staying at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. Then Uppalavaṇṇā Bhikkhunī was staying at Savatthi in the king's park among the Bhikkhunī Sangha. Early in the morning, she put on her robe, took her bowl, and entered Savatthi on alms round. When she had eaten, she returned to the monastery, put away her robe and bowl, washed her feet, took her sitting cloth, put it on her shoulder, and went into the Andavana. She sat under a tree and entered into mental unification for the day. So here we have the introduction, which is setting the scene for this sutta. So firstly, we see that Uppalavaṇṇā is staying in a place called the King's Park, which is a Bhikkhuni monastery. And that's interesting because the King's Park is mentioned very, very often in the Sanskrit and Chinese sources as a place for bhikkhunis, as a bhikkhuni monastery, and it doesn't occur at all, ever in the Pali tradition, to my knowledge. So to my knowledge, the Pali tradition doesn't actually preserve the names of any monasteries of the bhikkhunis. So in the Pali tradition, it's not actually clear if the bhikkhunis had their own places to stay, or if they just stayed in the monks' monasteries, like in a separate area of the monks' monasteries. But in the Chinese sources, it's quite clear that they had their own places, and the King's Park is the most famous of them. And then we also see she's going on alms round. She's doing that alone, which is the usual way of doing alms round in the early text. So in the early texts, we usually see monks and nuns going in alms alone or in small groups, such as maybe a teacher bhikkhuni with her students, but we never see the entire sangha going together. So if, like in modern times, when we think of alms round, usually we think of the Thai style of doing it, where the entire sangha of one monastery goes together and they all go out in one line and go through the village and come back together. But that's not how the early sangha did it. So in the early sangha, people were much more independent and they much more did their own things. And so we see Uppalavaṇṇā doing it also this way. And then she also goes into the forest alone. So here's the forest is mentioned. The forest that is mentioned is the Andavana, and this mention also is very significant. And I think it's significant for two reasons. The first one is the name Andavana is usually or very often translated as the blind man's grove, but literally it means like Anda means dark and Vana means forest, so the dark forest. And Vantsuchatu, for example, translates as Mirkwood. For Germans would translate as Black Forest, I think. Yeah, anyway, so she's not going into some lovely, beautiful mango grove. She's actually going really into like the deepest possible seclusion, into the dark forest. And she's going there alone, as we see. And the second reason why the Andavana is so significant is because there is a long tradition in all Buddhist schools that associates bhikkhunīs with the Andavana. And in the Mahishasaka Vinaya, which is a Chinese Vinaya, there is a story preserved, an origin story to one of the rules, one of the Pachitya rules, which tells us that the Andavana used to be a property that belonged to the bhikkhunīs. So, and also in all traditions, we regularly see bhikkhunīs going there. So clearly they made good use of their property. And even like in the Vinaya, even the nuns who were misbehaving nuns regularly go to the Andavana and do meditation there. So when we see, when we're going to talk about Thulananda, for example, those of you who know Thulananda is the foremost nun of misbehavior. So that's why I thought it would be nice to have a session on her in our course of foremost bhikkhunīs, because she is foremost in misbehavior. And when we talk about her, we will see that she's also doing meditation in the Andavana, as do many other monks and nuns, many other nuns, not monks. And in that story in the Vinaya, the Mahishasaka Vinaya, which tells that the bhikkhunīs had this property, it is said that eventually the bhikkhunīs exchanged that property with a property of the monks that was situated in the city and that had a building built on it. So when I read that, I had this kind of insight moment where I realized actually for the first time that when the wilderness rules were imposed on the nuns, that wasn't just a way of controlling the movement of the nuns, and it wasn't just a way of securing prestige for the male sangha, because obviously if you create obstacles for the nuns to properly practice Dharma, then there won't be so many highly developed nuns. And also if the monks are the only ones who can practice ascetic practices and do like the real stuff in the forest, whereas all the nuns live together with the lay people in the village, then obviously there would be like lay people would perceive a huge difference in respect and in status between the two sanghas, and the monks' status would be elevated and the nuns would be reduced if they can't do the proper practice anymore, and if they're not perceived as proper renunciates anymore. But then I realized it's not only about prestige and it's not only about controlling the nuns. When the nuns no longer could stay in the wilderness, the monks also gained access to a lot of those good properties that previously belonged to the nuns. So there was also material benefit from obstructing nuns from practicing in the wilderness. And when I read this story about the Andavana, that's actually the first time that I thought about that. So that's why I think the references to the Andavana are really very significant here. And anyway, the story then continues. Then Mara, the evil one, thought, now the recluse Gautama is staying at Savatthi in Jeta's grove, Anathapindika's park. Uppalavaṇṇā bhikkhunī is staying at Savatthi in the king's park among the bhikkhunī sangha. Early in the morning, she put on her robe, took her bowl, and entered Savatthi on alms round. When she had eaten, she returned to the monastery, put away her robe and bowl, washed her feet, took her sitting cloth, put it on her shoulder, and went into the Andavana. She is sitting under a tree and has entered into mental unification for the day. I'll now go there and make trouble. Then he transformed himself into a young, handsome man, went to Uppalavaṇṇā bhikkhunī, and spoke a verse. You're staying under this blossoming sala tree, alone, without a companion. Don't you fear evil men? Then Uppalavaṇṇā bhikkhunī thought, who is this that wants to frighten me? Is it a human? Is it a non-human? Is it a rapist? Having thought this, she realized, this must be Mara, the evil one, who just wants to disturb me. Then she spoke a verse. Even if 100,000 men, all rapists, like you, evil Mara, came here to me, they could not stir a hair on my body. I don't fear you, evil Mara. So here we have Mara challenging the bhikkhuni and playing with that fear of being alone in the forest and there being the possibility of the nun being attacked. So he is basically whatever, like when the wilderness rules were imposed on the bhikkhunis, this is the reason that is given for the protection of the bhikkhunis, because they should fear evil men. But what we see in this sutta is that this is actually the thinking of Mara. This is not the thinking of enlightenment and wisdom. So in this sutta, it becomes very clear that people who speak like this just parrot what Mara would be saying. And Uppalavaṇṇā makes it very clear. I mean, at this point, she's an arahant. She's the foremost in psychic powers. Even 100,000 men cannot do anything to her. She's independent. She's strong. She has totally overcome fear. Nobody can do anything to her because she is the foremost in psychic powers. So, but Mara doesn't let it go at this point. He speaks another verse. I'll now enter your belly and stay inside your organs. If I dwell between your two eyebrows, you can't see me. Then Uppalavaṇṇā bhikkhunī spoke another verse. My mind has great might. The psychic powers are well developed. The great fetters have been released. I don't fear you, evil Mara. I have expelled the 3 pollutants, which are the roots of fear. I dwell in a fearless state. I don't fear Mara's army. Free from all the light, apart from all ignorance, having realized extinguishment, I live at peace with taints destroyed. I know you, evil Mara. You should vanish and leave. Then Mara, the evil one, thought, Uppalavaṇṇā bhikkhunī knows my mind. Worried and sad, he disappeared from sight. So Uppalavaṇṇā makes a very strong statement here. She states how powerful she is, how independent she is. And yeah, let's count how many times she says that she's not fearful. So she says, I don't fear you. Then she says another time, I don't fear you. Then she says she has expelled the 3 pollutants, which are the root of fear. Then she says she's fearless. And again, she doesn't fear Mara. So I don't know how she could have made it any clearer that men cannot attack her, that she's so powerful, so independent, that nobody can do anything to her. And when she goes into the wilderness, there's nothing that can happen to her. And we see this is the nun speaking in her own voice. This is the testimony of an early bhikkhuni and her attitudes and how she perceives going into the wilderness. And still, even though she could not have made it any clearer, she is the one who in all of the later traditions is associated with rape and associated with sexual assault. So this is obviously a very strange situation. So we're going to have a look at these later texts and then see what happened and see if we can find an explanation why all these rape stories are associated with her, even though she herself, in her own words, in her own testimony, makes it very clear that she doesn't need to fear being raped. So now we're having a look at those later stories, the Vinaya rules about Uppalavaṇṇā and sexual assault. And we are going to start with the Pali version. And in the Pali version, this story is found in the Bhikkhu Parajika 1. And obviously that is a very strange situation that a story about a bhikkhuni is found in a bhikkhu rule. And the reason for that is, I've mentioned that already in our first session when we talked about the first council, and when we had a look at how the texts were compiled. We know that bhikkhunis were not present at the first council. We know that they did not represent their own tradition, and they did not get the chance to collect their own vinaya. So we know that the monks collected a complete vinaya for the monks' rules, and for the nuns, they did not collect a complete vinaya. They only collected those rules that are not shared with the bhikkhus. So, but Parajika 1 is actually the first rule of the Vinaya, and this is the rule about having sexual intercourse. So this rule says that if a monk or nun has sexual intercourse, they have to immediately disrobe. They're no longer a monk or nun. And technically, this is classified as a shared rule. So that's why the nuns don't have their own commentary or their own explanatory material on this rule, but actually the two rules are significantly different between the monks and the nuns, which then of course is problematic because now the nuns don't have explanations for all the things that are different for them. So for the monks, the rules is if a bhikkhu who has not disrobed has sexual intercourse even with an animal, then he is parajika. And for the nuns, the rule is if a nun willingly has sexual intercourse even with an animal, she is parajika. So there's no mention of disrobing first, and the word willingly is included for the nuns to make it very clear that all kinds of sexual coercion or rape or assault are not included under this rule. So as the nuns don't have their own explanatory material, the story about a nun has to be included in the bhikkhu version. So the story goes as follows. At one time, a young Brahmin had fallen in love with the nun Uppalavaṇṇā. When Uppalavaṇṇā had entered the village for alms, he entered her hut and hid himself. After her meal, when she had returned from alms round, Uppalavaṇṇā washed her feet, entered her hut, and sat down on the bed. Then that young Brahmin took hold of her and raped her. She told the nuns what had happened. The nuns told the monks, who in turn told the Buddha. There's no offense for one who doesn't consent. So the Buddha again makes it clear, because as I mentioned, in the monk's rule, consent isn't mentioned, the word willingly isn't mentioned. So the Buddha has to make it clear again that if you don't consent, there is no offense, you don't break this rule. And we see that the rule about wildernesses is not laid down here in the Pali version, because as I said, this is the bhikkhu vinaya. So of course you cannot lay down this rule because you don't want it to cover the bhikkhus. So in the Pali tradition, the wilderness rule is actually separate from the incident with Uppalavaṇṇā, unlike the other schools. So before we talk about this in more detail, I want to read all the other texts so we can talk about all of them together. And the next text we are looking at is from a school that is called the Dharma Gupta school. And I'm aware that I haven't given a proper introduction into the Vinayas and into the schools. And as we discussed last time, we will probably have a special extra session on Bhikkhuni Vinaya. And then I will explain this in more detail, but for today, I'm not going to explain this in more detail, and I hope that you can just be patient until we have the other session. So the Dhammaguptaka school is another school. This is the school in which monastics still practice nowadays in the Mahayana tradition. And this text is found in a collection that is called the Kandakas. And the Kandakas are collections of rules that are also later than the Patimokkha rules. So we know that this is a later text. And the text says, then Uppalavaṇṇā bhikkhuni did walking meditation in the wilderness. The bhikkhuni's appearance was beautiful, and there was a young Brahmin who, when he saw her, attached his mind to her. Then he grabbed her and wanted to rape her. The bhikkhuni said, "Let me go, I'll go to the toilet." He then let her go, and Uppalavaṇṇā bhikkhuni went to the toilet and smeared excrement on her body. The Brahmin got angry and hit her head with a stone so that both her eyes popped out. Uppalavaṇṇā hadn't remembered that she had psychic powers, but later it came to her mind again. Then she flew to the Buddha with her psychic powers, and having paid respect with her head at his feet, she stood at one side, and the Buddha said, "This bhikkhuni has joyous faith. Her eyes will return as before." Then as he spoke, they returned as before. The bhikkhuni had doubts. The Buddha said, "There is no offense. A bhikkhuni should not go to the wilderness." So I think, yeah, there's a lot to say about this story, but as we see, the next one is very, very similar to this one. So let's read through the next two stories and then talk about everything together. And the next one is from a school that is called the Sarvastivada school. And the text says, "The Buddha was at Savatthi. At that time, Uppalavaṇṇā bhikkhuni, before midday, put on her robes, took her bowl, and entered the city on alms round. After the meal, she put her sitting cloth on her shoulder and went into the Andavana. She laid out her sitting cloth and sat in half lotus position under a tree." So we see this introductory portion is exactly the same, or pretty much exactly the same, a clear copy of her early sutta that we read just now. So there is a clear connection between those two texts, and the sutta we read from just now was also from the Sarvastivada tradition. So it is very clear that when the story here came into being, they were aware of Uppalavaṇṇā sutta, and they copied from that to make it look more authentic. And even though they were aware of that early sutta, still the content that they put into this story is basically the exact opposite of that sutta. So yeah, it's interesting what happened here. And the story continues. "Then there was the son of a Brahmin in whose mind craving and attachment towards the bhikkhuni had arisen. He went to the bhikkhuni and said, 'Let's have sex together.' Uppalavaṇṇā bhikkhuni thought, 'If I oppose him, he'll take me by force.' She said to him, 'Wait a little.' He asked, 'Why should I wait a little?' Then the bhikkhuni, with her psychic powers, turned the inside of her body outside. So she displayed her organs. The son of a Brahmin said angrily, 'Wah, that's disgusting.' Then he beat her head with his fist, and both her eyes popped out. Another bhikkhuni put her eyes into a water jug and led her to the Buddha. The Buddha said to the bhikkhunis, 'You should make an asseveration of truth.' Uppalavaṇṇā bhikkhuni has profoundly joyous faith in the Buddha's Dharma. She has nothing to purify in regard to the Buddha, the Dharma, or the Sangha. She has nothing to be criticized for in regard to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By this truth, let her two eyes become as before." So we see the Buddha asked them to make an asseveration of truth, Saccakiriya in Pali. So just to explain, in case somebody doesn't know what that is, this is a very popular motif in both the early and the later traditions. So we have that in the very late texts, such as the commentaries, for example, in Queen Anoja's story of her going forth. Queen Anoja was the wife of Mahakappina. And we have it in early texts also, for example, in Angulimala's story. So I'm assuming everybody knows Angulimala. He was the bandit who killed a lot of people and who made the finger garland. And he became an arahant. And when he was an arahant, he was full of compassion for all beings. And then one day he saw a woman giving birth, and she was having a breech birth. So the baby was stuck, and it seemed like both the woman and the baby were dying. And then the Buddha told him to make an asseveration of truth. Because back then it was believed that if you speak a truth, a profoundly truthful statement, that has a very special power and is able to work a miracle. So the Buddha told Angulimala to say how harmless he is towards all living beings. And so he made that statement, and by that truthful statement, the woman and the baby survived. So this belief in the power of speaking a truthful statement is very popular among all Buddhist traditions, And so here in this case, they use it to restore Uppalavaṇṇā's eyes. So when the bhikkhunīs had carried out this asseveration of truth, her eyes became as before. The Buddha said to the bhikkhunīs, from now on, bhikkhunīs may not stay in the wilderness. If they stay there, they incur a dukkata. A dukkata is a minor offense. And then the last text we are reading is from the Mulasavastivada tradition. And it's also very similar to the first two we have read. And it goes as follows. The Buddha was at Rajagaha in the bamboo grove. In this city, there was a prostitute named Uppalavaṇṇā who made a living by displaying her beauty as a profession. Then a Brahmin came and said, young woman, are you well? Please have sex with me. She replied, do you have money? He answered, no, I don't. The woman said, please go and search for money. Come back later and see me. He answered, I will search. He then went to the south to do business everywhere and acquired 500 gold coins. Then he returned to the woman's place. By then, Uppalavaṇṇā, relying on the Venerable Moggallana as a spiritual friend, had gone forth, received the full ordination, and attained arahantship. As it was pleasing to her, she had left Rajagaha and gone to Savatthi. At that time, the world-honored one had not yet barred bhikkhunīs from staying in the wilderness. Then Uppalavaṇṇā went to the dark wood. So again, we see the connection to the Andavana here. To sit in meditation in a quiet place, enter into samadhi, and feel the bliss of liberation. The Brahmin took the 500 gold coins, went to Rajagaha, and asked the people, where has the woman Uppalavaṇṇā gone? They answered, she went forth in the Dhamma of the second sun and has gone to Savatthi. When he heard what they said, he went to Jetavana and asked the bhikkhus, noble ones, where is the woman from Rajagaha called Uppalavaṇṇā now, who has wandered here? They answered, that woman has given up what is against Dhamma and gone forth. She single-mindedly practices inside in the dark wood. Then he went there and addressed her, young woman, previously you've spoken truthfully, and now I came here with money. Please have sex with me. She replied, Brahmin, I've given up this sinful, bad profession. It's proper for you to leave now. He replied, young woman, even though you reject me, I won't reject you. You should get up and come. I certainly won't let you go. She replied, which part or limb of my body do you delight in? He answered, I love your eyes. Then she scooped out her 2 eyes with her supernormal powers and gave them to him. Then the Brahmin thought, this bald renunciate woman can perform such feats of witchcraft. He beat the bhikkhuni's head with his fist, released her, and went away. Then she told the bhikkhuni sangha about this incident. The bhikkhunis told the bhikkhus, and the bhikkhus told the Buddha. The Buddha thought, because the bhikkhunis stay in the wilderness, there was this transgression. From now on, bhikkhunis should not seek seclusion in the dark wood or in the wilderness. If they stay there, they incur a minor offense. So I think it's quite obvious that the last 3 stories that we have read through are very similar. They have very, very similar motifs. They probably stem from a common origin. So in each case, we have a the bhikkhuni Uppalavaṇṇā. She's going into the wilderness. Then she is harassed by a man, and in some way or another, her eyes are taken out. And at that point, the Brahmin goes away, and she, by some means or other, gets to the Buddha, and a miracle happens, and her eyes return as before. So I think probably this story is quite familiar to most people who know a little bit about the Pali tradition, because in the Pali tradition, we have this story too. The only thing is, in our tradition, this is not the story of Uppalavaṇṇā. This story is the story of Subba in Jivaka's mango grove. So Subba has a long poem in the Therīgāthā where she tells this entire story, where she also goes into the wilderness, this mango grove, and a man obstructs her path and tries to convince her to indulge in various kinds of sense pleasures with her and doesn't want to let her go. And she tries to teach him the Dhamma, but he just doesn't let her go and keeps on praising her eyes. And eventually she pulls out her eye and hands it to him. And he's shocked and disgusted and then backs off at that point. And she goes to the Buddha, and also a miracle happens and her eye is restored as before. So we see this story was popular among most of the Buddhist tradition, but this story was not necessarily always attributed to Uppalavaṇṇā. Yeah, what is happening here? Why do so many Buddhist traditions preserve the idea that Uppalavaṇṇā is the one who gets raped in the wilderness or gets sexually assaulted in various ways in the wilderness? Yeah, why Uppalavaṇṇā specifically in all the stories? And I think because especially Uppalavaṇṇā is the one who in the early text speaks out and says nobody can attack her, she is entirely safe in the wilderness. So why is she the one who to whom all these stories are attached by later tradition? So, and I think to understand what's going on, we have to understand that obviously the early sutta is extremely challenging for the later tradition, because in the early sutta, Uppalavaṇṇā declares how independent she is, how she doesn't have to fear any man, how she is strong and powerful, and how she has authority and the psychic powers. And that means no man can have any kind of control over her. And that's, of course, hugely challenging for the later tradition, where the monks' sangha is in a position where they exert power over the bhikkhunīs, and where they exert control over the bhikkhunīs in various ways, and where they want to make it very clear that there is no gender equality, but there is a hierarchy in the sangha. And so a nun who declares her independence and who says that no man can do anything to her is, of course, a problem for later tradition. So by imposing these wilderness rules, you have to attach them to Uppalavaṇṇā. It doesn't make sense to attach them to anyone else, because Uppalavaṇṇā is the most powerful bhikkhuni. So she is the foremost in psychic powers. And by attaching this story to her, what you're showing basically is that no matter how powerful, how accomplished you are as a bhikkhuni, because you're a woman, even the most random guy can come and attack you. So in these stories, it's not like there's a highly accomplished man who comes and attacks Uppalavaṇṇā. It's not that the person also has psychic powers. It's not like they are very strong or in any other way extraordinary. It's like the most random guy comes and overpowers Uppalavaṇṇā. And by showing that even the most powerful bhikkhuni can be overpowered by the most random guy, that doesn't leave any wiggle room for any other bhikkhuni to question this rule. Because obviously, like it's very easy to come up with reasons why the wilderness rules shouldn't apply to a certain person or to a certain group. For example, you could say it shouldn't apply if the wilderness is reasonably safe, or it shouldn't apply to older bhikkhunis because they're no longer sexually attractive, or it shouldn't apply to people who are ugly, or it shouldn't apply to women who are very strong and physically capable to deal with men. So there could be a lot of reasons why bhikkhunis could question these rules. But if you show that even the most powerful nun is not able to deal with a single man, then there is no wiggle room for any other bhikkhuni, because no bhikkhuni can compare herself to Uppalavaṇṇā. So that's why it has to be Uppalavaṇṇā who is put into all these stories to stop questioning the dominance of the male sangha. And finally, before we wrap up, I would like to show you the rest of the wilderness rules. And I think they show a similar tendency. So first of all, like these are wilderness rules that don't deal with Uppalavaṇṇā. These are from other traditions. And in the Pali, we have the rule here in the Bhikkhuni Khandaka as well. And as I mentioned, it couldn't be attached in the Vinaya itself, it couldn't be attached to Uppalavaṇṇā because the Uppalavaṇṇā story was in the bhikkhu part of the Vinaya. But as we have seen in the commentarial story that we read in the beginning, the commentaries then say that this rule was laid down like in relation to what happened to Uppalavaṇṇā. But in the Vinaya itself, the story is very brief and there is not much background. It's just at that time, the nuns were living in the wilderness, scoundrels raped them. They told the Buddha and he said, a nun should not live in the wilderness. If she does, she commits an offense of wrong conduct. And very similar, the same story is in the Chinese Dharma Gupta Khandaka. And as we have seen just now, the Chinese Dharma Gupta Khandaka also has the story about Uppalavaṇṇā. So the same rule is laid down twice about not staying in the wilderness. And that's obviously a telltale sign that there was a corruption in the text, because usually if a rule is laid down and somebody breaks it, the Buddha would say, well, deal with her in accordance with the rule, so make a confession or whatever the rule requires to clear the offense, but he wouldn't lay down the rule again. So yeah, so the way it appears here in the Chinese Dharma Guptaka doesn't really make too much sense. On the other hand, this is something that is very common in the Chinese Dharma Guptaka tradition. Many rules are reduplicated. And I think the reason for that is very likely that they had two manuscripts that, like it seems to me, they had two manuscripts. They were slightly different. They didn't know which one was the most authentic one. So they merged the two. And that's why so many rules there are there twice. But also the Chinese version is very brief, very similar to the Pali as usual. Then the bhikkhunīs stayed in the wilderness. At a later time, problems arose in the wilderness. The bhikkhus told the Buddha, and the Buddha said bhikkhunīs should not stay in the wilderness. So there's nothing special here, actually. But the last text here is a text that, again, is very interesting. This one is from a tradition called the Mahasanghikas. The Mahasanghikas are the school that split off from the other schools first. So the result of the first split. So these should be the texts that are the most removed from all the other traditions. And the Mahasanghika has a branch school or sub-school called the Lokuttaravada. And so this same text is preserved in Chinese and Sanskrit, but because both of the texts are really similar, I didn't want to put it here twice. So we are reading from the Chinese version here. And the Buddha was staying at Savatthi. At that time, the precept about bhikkhunīs and the wilderness had not yet been laid down. There was no accommodation in villages yet. Then 500 bhikkhunīs with Mahapajapati as their leader were staying in the King's Park. So again, here we see the reference to the King's Park monastery for bhikkhunīs in a totally different tradition. The Mahasanghikas is very different from the Sarvastivada tradition that we read before. The women from Sakyan and Malyan families were young and graceful. Some young men waited for them at the beginning of the night and wanted to get hold of the bhikkhunīs. Having seen them, the bhikkhunīs rose up in the air and left. So that means they had deep samadhi, profound attainments, and also the psychic powers here, because they could fly away. In the middle of the night, the young men came back again, and the bhikkhunīs did the same thing again. At the end of the night, they came again. Among the bhikkhunīs were some with dull faculties who had not entered concentration and were sleeping. So they then didn't manage to leave and were raped. Mahapajapati went to the world-honored one and informed him of this matter. The Buddha said, "From now on, it is no longer allowed for bhikkhuni to stay in the wilderness. If the 4 assemblies gather throughout the night to hear the Dhamma, she's allowed to stay. At that time, she may not be in a secluded place. If a bhikkhuni stays in the wilderness, she breaks a minor Vinaya rule. This is called the rule on the wilderness." So here we see it's not Uppalavaṇṇā who is in the story. Instead, it's Mahapajapati. But I think it serves a very similar purpose, because obviously Mahapajapati is also a very, very highly accomplished nun. All the traditions preserve stories about her psychic powers. And also she's the leader of the Bhikkhuni Sangha, so it serves the same purpose. If Mahapajapati isn't safe, then nobody is safe. And here again, we see the Bhikkhunis had psychic powers. and there were 500 of them. So this story tells us that highly accomplished bhikkhunīs, together with Mahapajapati, who had psychic powers and who were in a really, really large group, were not able to defend themselves against a much smaller group of random guys who didn't have any special attainments or who didn't have any special accomplishments or any weapons or anything. So again, the story serves the same purpose to show us no matter how big your group is, no matter how accomplished you are, as a woman, you cannot be safe. You cannot, like the most accomplished woman is not able to protect herself against the most random guy. So that clearly puts bhikkhunīs in their place, and the most accomplished woman isn't able to compete with the most random guy. So the gender differences here are really put in the foreground. And even though Uppalavaṇṇā isn't in the story, I think the story was written with the same intention. So this is all I have prepared for today. I hope it was beneficial for you. I hope you gained some insight in how the early text and the later text developed. To recap what we did today, we looked at the early sutta in which the nuns' own voices are preserved, where their own testimony is given, and where they say that they're happy to dwell in the wilderness, they are confident, they're powerful, they are autonomous, they don't rely on others, they don't need to rely on others. And that was completely turned upside down by the text of the later tradition. So that's all for today. And if you have any questions or comments, then now would be a good time to ask. Esther, yeah?
Yeah, maybe it's dull, but it comes to mind. What purpose should the later bhikkhus have to be so malicious against bhikkhunīs?
I think not malicious, but it's a problem for the later tradition when you have such strong independent nuns who are not submissive to the monks in a system where the two sanghas are not equal, where you really need you need the bhikkhunīs to submit to the bhikkhus, and where you need them to keep the Dhammas, and where you need them to not challenge the hierarchies as they are imposed at a later time. So I don't think it's necessarily malicious, but obviously the early stories are very, very challenging to the status quo of the later tradition. And we've seen, like in the last few sessions that we have looked at, how the position of women is no longer equal to men, how there is a large gender, like a growing gender discrimination over time. And also, I think the society expected the bhikkhus to be the guardians of the bhikkhunīs. So bhikkhunīs, like women, were no longer able to be independent agents on their own. They had to be like women were defined at a later time in relationship to a man, like to their husband or to their father, and as bhikkhunīs then in relationship to the bhikkhu sangha as their guardians. So so that requires a certain hierarchy between the sanghas. And I mean, probably there was also a concern for the bhikkhunīs, like when the bhikkhus feel responsible for the bhikkhunīs, then it's much easier for them if they stay in the villages, because then nothing can, like, there's much less likely that something would happen to them. But that obviously also really restricts the ability of bhikkhunīs to practice properly. And yeah, I had another thought just now, but it has escaped me now. I hope it's coming back. Yes, and the other thing, as I mentioned when I explained about the Andavana, the bhikkhus also have advantages if the status of the nuns is reduced. Like there's more prestige, there's the higher status of them, they get more support, they get more recognition, and also they get access to all the nice properties that previously belonged to the nuns, such as the Untitled. So I think there was like a sort of very conflicting mishmash of things going on. On the one hand, they were trying to be compassionate, trying to keep the nuns safe, but not letting the nuns make their own decisions about their own safety, about their own bodies, about what is appropriate for them, about what they feel, how they can keep themselves safe. So it's imposed from outside how they need to keep themselves safe. But probably with a compassionate intention, but on the other side, also there are obviously certain incentives for making sure that the monks and the nuns aren't equal. And I mean, we see that until nowadays, that like there's a huge difference in respect and recognition between what is given to the monk sangha and what is given to the nun sangha, and how that impacts the ability of women to practice. Like there's so many women who don't find places to stay because everybody just builds monasteries for monks. And even if monasteries for nuns are built, then it's really hard for them to survive because they don't get donations. And because the conditions they live in, they are so cramped all together, all bunched together. So there's no possibility to practice in seclusion. So it's like even nowadays, it's so much more difficult for bhikkhunīs because of texts like this that show that bhikkhunīs aren't equal to the monks. And of course, if you have those texts, then of course, like if you're a lay person and you want to make the most merit, it's logical that you give to the monks, because that's like if they have a higher status, then you make more merit there. But that's not at all how it was done in the early sangha. That's what I'm trying to show. Yeah. Please, Svanchi, yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, Cindy, call me Cindy. Hi,
Cindy,
everyone.
okay.
Yeah, sorry, I've come to your talks, but because of timing and other stuff, I'm always a little bit late, so apologize for that. But thank you for all your talks. It's eye-opening. I'm still very new learning about Buddhism, but yeah, it's a little bit shocking, to be honest, hearing about a lot of things, which I guess, yeah, we don't know the story behind the stories. But what I wanted to ask was, historically, so what do we know about the time of the Buddha and the Therīs when they were around? What was it about their society that made it possible for the Therīs to thrive and be in that? What was it that allowed that to happen, which subsequently declined? Do we know much about that?
Yeah, so it seems that of course the sangha isn't completely independent from the society at large. The Buddha set up the sangha to be very much interdependent with the society and to very much rely on lay support also. So to some extent, the sangha also has to adapt to changing values in society. So and when values change in society, usually what changes first is the ability of women to be independent or to be under the authority of others. So the status of women is something that has historically changed over time very often. And it seems that in the Buddha's time, society was pretty open-minded. I think we've talked about this also in previous sessions already. So there was, we see in the early text, there was a strong expectation that a teaching that is well explained, a good Dhamma should be catering towards both men and women. So there was an expectation of gender equality in religious practice. There was an expectation that any good spiritual teacher would set up a male sangha and a female sangha and would give opportunities for all genders. And yeah, to me, it seems that society changed to some extent. And like we know in the Buddha's time, there also were a lot of female sanghas in other non-Buddhist movements, like the Jain female sangha, There were ajivikas, there were female Brahmin practitioners, there were female wanderers, they were just completely independent. I didn't have any affiliation with any kind of movement. But that seems to have changed in the decades or centuries after the Buddha, and society seems to have changed. And also one other thing that we've talked about in our first session also, I think, is that there were also different tendencies in the sangha, different groups. The sangha wasn't one homogeneous block. So some people were kind of opposed to bhikkhunīs, some monks, and that's kind of understandable if you see this in terms of the practice where people have to keep celibacy, and where the social norms are such that like heteronormative practices are the ones that are like encouraged, or that people subscribe to. So as a monk who has to keep celibacy, usually, and if you struggle with that, if you're not an arahant yet, then you have to keep away from women, and women are tempting you, and you have to be very careful around women. So there was it's very easy then to demonize the female sangha, because they are always tempting you and are always challenging you and threatening also your monastic life. Because if you give in to those tendencies, of course, as I mentioned, parajika 1, you have to disrobe immediately. So in that way, like for a celibate movement, it's very easy to demonize the female side. So I think many things came together. Anna-Marie, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Aya, so much. I'm really inspired. It just makes so much sense, what you're sharing today. Like for the only early text that we have, if I understand it correctly, like the only early text that we have on the subject to be one of, you know, this is the practice that leads to overcoming all fear, including this one, and that everything else to be, what Esther was talking about earlier as well, about it's not just something that, like nowadays, that's visible in the sangha, but like I think in wider society, like a symptom of patriarchy or any demographic that's in charge, or that has the power, will be threatened by, whether it's based on gender or skin color or anything, will be threatened by other groups, and that to sort of have crept into the later text, that I'm still processing it, but it all seems to make a lot of sense. So thank you very much.
Tracy, yes.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciated this as well. I'm curious. I think that the point you make about the wilderness rule being a way that to justify the seizure of like the nun's property. I mean, that's like putting it in one. Maybe that's not exactly what happened, but that it justifies the fact that, you know, the bhikkhuni sangha no longer had possession of these properties that they did in the Buddhist time. I'm curious, like, does the Vinaya like talk about administration of property at all?
The nuns Vinaya doesn't really. I mean, well, to some extent, it doesn't go into much detail, but it's kind of implicit that the properties were managed. Like you have various sangha officials for the various duties that are associated with property management, such as building projects or repairs and things like that. And then we have references to kind of monastery workers, like lay people who lived in the monastery to provide whatever services were necessary, and also maintained the property and did things that the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis couldn't do, such as like pruning trees or maintaining whatever the paths and digging in the ground and doing like whatever property management things were necessary. So in that sense, yeah, there are references in the Vinaya. On the other hand, also, very often the person who donated the land, they would feel responsible, and they would also often provide workers and you know, do whatever is necessary there. So I think it's not fully clear to what extent the Sangha did that themselves and to what extent the original donors or other lay people would do that. Yeah. And also a wilderness property doesn't really need that much management in the first place, I think.
Thank you.
Okay, so I just wanted to check in with you again. Last time we discussed whether or not people would be interested to have a special session about Bhikkhuni Vinaya, especially about Sikamana training and about the ordination rules. So I just wanted to see if people are still interested. If you're interested, we can do it next week. But if not, we can also skip it. So can you raise your hand if you're interested? Yeah. Okay. 4 people, 5. Okay, most people are interested. So then next week we will talk about Bhikkhuni Vinaya and push everything back 1 week. So let me see, did I prepare the new? I think I prepared the new course outline. Oh no, what happened? Yeah. Oops. Sorry about that. So today we did the session Uppalavaṇṇā. Next week we are going to do the Bhikkhuni Vinaya and Sikamanas. Then we're going to have everything that we were planning to have 1 week later. And I canceled the session on Sela. So in total, we're still having 12 sessions as before because I've left one out. And we were also thinking about having one bonus session about the 7 sisters stories. Yeah, I haven't decided yet if we're going to do that and when, like if we do it, then when we would do it. So we'll have to see how it goes. And I think we can discuss it again in a few weeks to see if people are still interested in that later. So are there any other questions that have come up so far? No? Esther, I remember last time you had a question about Rahula and the 7 sisters. And you asked if Rahula was one of the brothers of the 7 sisters, so one of the sons of King Kiki. And I looked it up in the commentaries, and according to some commentaries, yes, he was the eldest son of King Kiki, and he took over the kingdom from King Kiki when King Kiki passed away. But according to other commentaries, it wasn't Rahula, it was another monk called Ratapala. And the reason for the confusion seems to be that 100,000 eons ago, under Padumuttara Buddha's time, Rahula and Ratapala were 2 brothers, and they made marriage together, and then their fate became intertwined. And that's why they very often were born together. And that's why apparently the commentary made this confusion, and it's not quite clear which of the 2 was the son of King Kiki. And also in Uppalavaṇṇā's Apadānas stories, she says that she was very, very often reborn together with Rahula. So their fate was also intertwined for a very long time. So in that sense, it makes sense that it should be Rahula and it should not be Ratapala, because obviously Uppalavaṇṇā is one of the 7 sisters. So it would be her brother. Rahula would be her brother in that case. But yeah, the tradition isn't fully clear. So to answer your question, it's not clear. Yeah. Okay, I think if there are no other questions, then we will end with 3 sadhus, and I will see you all next week. Sadhu, 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 sadhu.